With this last presentation of today, I have this sometimes a bit difficult task to bring all the strands that we were discussing together. I think I won't do this completely in the next 20 minutes, and I also won't answer all the questions that you wrote for discussion, but but I will try to give, or I will try to present maybe one answer to one of the questions, and this is the elaboration of the different patterns of external support to civil society, and the question which civil society emerges, why, and how can we deal with these aspects of a supported, externally supported civil society. Okay, and we see a blue screen. Okay, so hopefully you can read a little bit of my presentation. So bringing it a little bit to filter this large question on the impact of external support on civil society, I would mainly elaborate on one very central question, and this is the question of how can foreign culture and education policy contribute to democratization. So I try to make it also a little bit smaller, coming back from this huge part of democracy promotion. Nevertheless, we have to speak about patterns of external democracy promotion and of patterns of how civil society reacts to this external support. And therefore, I will first speak a little bit of the premises of external democracy promotion, and I think I stick a little bit to what we heard in the morning, presented by Annette Zimmer, and also presented by Hubert Strachwitz, so some basics on civil society theory and support theory. Then I will present some findings on ambivalent effects of external support to civil society, and here we see that there's a very differentiated pattern of how civil society reacts on external support. And I will explain these different strategies, and I will talk a little bit more about the strategy of supporting culture and bringing education and cultural politics to civil society. And I will probably speak a little bit about Ukraine, which is my research focus, and more than, I would say, 1.5 decades. Okay, so first, what are the premises of external democracy promotion? What do we think, or what do we consider civil society to be? How should it function in a democratization process? We were discussing this morning about what is your definition of civil society, who belongs to civil society. I would propose that we shouldn't speak about who belongs to civil society, but what should civil society do in a democratization process? How can civil society activists contribute to democratization? And that means that we are speaking about roles and functions, so functions of civil society in democratization processes. And first of all, of course, we have to be clear about what is democratization. We could argue with Charles Tilley that democratization means a net movement toward broader, more equal, more protected, and more binding consultation. And this consultation is a binding consultation between the citizenry and the state, and civil society can contribute to make this consultation process more broad, more equal, more protected, and more binding. So this would be one aspect. And then we can speak about, well, what our external democracy promoters have in mind when they want civil society to contribute to these processes. And there we could argue that usually democracy promoters provide a certain set of measures and actions to actors who think in the same direction as they do to change a system, to overcome authoritarian rule. But how to overcome authoritarian rule? With which functions, with which approaches could civil society contribute to this process of transition from authoritarianism to democracy? And in asking these questions, what democracy promoters could have in mind when they support domestic civil society activists, we can discern these different functions based on political theory on civil society. And this morning we were speaking about different functions, different tasks of civil society. Remember that Mr. Stocklitz was talking about 8 different functions or 8 different tasks of civil society. I would even argue we could bring it down to 2 basic perspectives of how civil society could be part of democratization processes. And the first perspective would be the Republican perspective. So this is democratization from below. It is a certain complementary approach that civil society organizations foster democratization because they bring people together, they help networking, they help building social capital. They are a sort of school of democracy where people from different backgrounds come together, have to negotiate, have to be clear about how to build coalitions, how to overcome their cleavages, their differences, etc. So this is in this Tocquevillian sense, just bringing people together in an association and or helping them to overcome their differences and to sort of learn democracy on a very basic level. And the second perspective is the more liberal perspective of what we also heard this morning, being a watchdog, being an advocate, being the organization that makes clear that there's a government that does not really stick to the needs, to the demands of a society, etc. So these two perspectives could be called the main perspectives or the main approaches how civil society can foster democratization processes, either as a complementary on a societal base or more in a political and direct way in making clear, in starting to bark when governments tend to be more authoritarian or refuse to become more democratic and inclusive. And these different perspectives can be or should be fostered in democratization processes, or they can be fostered, and they will have a different impact on democratization processes. So remember this definition, overcoming authoritarian rule, changing authoritarian rule, is a process that can be seen as taking place in three different phases. First, we have a clear, very shortcut phase of a sort of revolutionary moment where authoritarian power is dissoluted. This can be a revolution, it can be a round table, but these are the moments when the authoritarian system breaks down. And after this breakdown, we have a second phase of the institutionalization of democratic institutions, and then we have a very, very, very long phase of consolidation. Ideally, this leads to a consolidated pluralistic democratic society. We know that that's not necessarily the path, but this is the ideal type idea of how these transitional processes will take place. And the liberal and the Republican perspective have a certain function in all of these different phases. So the liberal perspective of being of civil society being a watchdog, being an advocate, is of course very important in this very first phase, when it's necessary to bring people to the streets, to organize mass protests, and to overcome this authoritarian system in the very first step. And when it comes to institutionalization and consolidation, democratization processes from below, bringing people together, talking about their cleavages, building coalitions, etc., becomes much more important. Now, what has that to do with external supporters of civil society? When we are looking in particular on the civil society support activism, activities in post-socialist countries, we see that this ideal type phases model seems to be a very clear idea of most of the supporters of democratization processes, and most of those supporters tried to support the liberal perspective, because this is also what we experienced with Solidarność, for example, with all the other movements who were strong on the streets and important in the moment when it was about bringing down their dictators, bringing down their authoritarian systems. Remember all those revolutionary moments we also saw in Ukraine. Here, the liberal perspective of civil society is the dominant one. And this is the ideal picture or the ideal model that most of the democracy-promoting agents have in mind when they are thinking about how to support civil society, where to bring them with my support or with our support. And this led to very particular situations, in particular mainly in the post-socialist countries, where we came up with this strategy of supporting the watchdog civil society. And in doing so, most support was focusing on the well-established civil society organizations, on journalistic associations, on those organizations that were working and acting as advocates, as human rights activists, etc. So the very politically oriented organizations like election monitoring organizations, etc. And these civil society organizations became the main focus of external civil society support. What led to, it's a pity, I think you cannot really read that. What led to a certain divided civil society in most post-socialist and post-communist countries. The divided civil society means that those civil society organizations that were already strong, that were this corrective, these watchdog organizations were supported more and more, while smaller associations working very much on the ground, working as grassroots organizations to bring people together, to network, to discuss of things like where should we build our bus stop in the village, and what could be the frequency of the public buses. Those were totally neglected by the supporters because most of the supporters were focusing on the human rights activists, etc. Of course, supporting human rights organizations is an important issue, but this division of civil society and the emergence of a sort of artificial civil society, what was mainly focusing on these political service providers, became a huge problem in countries like Ukraine. Because the political service providers are a little bit like the social service providers, the only difference is that they stick their agenda very much to what external supported wanted them to be and to do, while others, being much more grassroots, didn't get any support. So this divided civil society, this is also a book which I co-edited with some colleagues. The divided civil society has certain unintended effects. And one of this is that while supporters were supporting this professionalization of civil society organizations, only a few service providers got support while others were more or less ignored. But there was also, we could also see a decline of social capital because competition instead of cooperation among civil society organizations was fostered. The idea of supporting political service providers or the strong NGOs was implemented in giving out calls for applications. So donors started their projects inviting NGOs to come up with their ideas, not only, but also with their organizational resources, and most of them had to prove that they have a professional accounting system, for example, that they have a huge list of references, of projects they already successfully implemented, etc., etc. So this continuing professionalization of civil society led to competition among organizations based on the funds and based on the support of external donors. And of course, these organizations became alienated from their society. And I think, I heard this today somewhere, I think you were talking about the civil society organizations who are not seen as a very positive thing by society. Of course, they are refused because they are seen as, well, a certain bubble that is near to politics, near to donors, near to anything, but not near to the pure society. And this is an aspect of this divided civil society, which is a consequence of a very particular idea of external donors of how to support and how to improve civil society activism in countries like Ukraine. Now the question is that all? And luckily that's not all. So there's not only professionalization. When we're going a little bit deeper in the strategies of civil society support, we see much more. And the pattern can be brought into three categories. So first, we have, and this is based on some empirical research I did a few years ago. So based on the script, so on the ideas of civil society functions and on certain aspects like budgets, project duration, etc., I could discern three basic strategies of how to support civil society. The first one is professionalization, so supporting the political service providers. But the second is what I call political cultural promotion, and here you hear that it's about culture and education policy. And the third one got a name that is not very, not so popular in these walls, let's say it like that. Public diplomacy is not, so that's not the original term of public diplomacy that you might have in mind, that is often mixed up with cultural diplomacy or things like that. The strategy of supporting civil society as a part of public diplomacy is based on an approach that usually embassies of smaller countries implement, and they have not a certain idea of what civil society should do with their support, how civil society should support democratization, but it's rather an idea of, well, we don't have a huge development program, we don't have a huge democracy promoting agency, but we are here as an embassy, we want to get to know people in this country, we want to build our networks in the society much better, we want to be more present, and that's why now we have a small human rights program somewhere in our embassy. So this is a sort of supporting civil society activists, not as an intrinsic idea of supporting civil society, but as, well, nice to have, and we need to have it to be present in the country. The more important aspects are the strategy of professionalization and, of course, the political culture promotion. Because here, political culture promotion, tries to support civil society as this Tocquevillian realm of negotiating and building coalitions, overcoming cleavages, etc. So here we can find this idea of a school for democracy, of building social capital, and of supporting those organizations and activists that are not merely and mainly focusing on political activism, but rather on arts, on culture, on those issues that are not too prominent on the political agenda. And that makes it interesting as a very indirect way of supporting democracy. Okay, I have to skip that because I think you cannot see this. Okay, this is part of my research where we could see who is or which organizations are the most important or the mainly supported organizations by external donors. And in the center of every circle is one donor, in Ukraine in this case, and this the big circle is these are all the organizations that are supported by the International Renaissance Foundation. But the more interesting circle is the smaller one here. See that one? Because these are organizations that are supported by the Renaissance Foundation and by others as well. And these are mainly organizations, about 100 organizations who have different donors in the same year. And most of, or nearly all of these massively supported organizations are political service providers. While the smaller parts are those organizations that stick more or less to one donor, and these are mainly cultural organizations, small activists, small festivals, etc., etc. So we see that the main focus of supporting civil society is still on the political service providers, but there is something different going on with very particular donors. And who are these particular donors? They are not donors in the traditional sense, but they are the cultural institutes, they are the German political foundations, they are the American National Endowment of Democracy, no, not the endowment, the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, the Swiss in part, and so some very few, very particular donor, but nearly all the cultural institutes are part of that strategy. And what we could see is that this professionalization depends on the support of the large donors with large budgets, but that the political cultural promotion, or let's say the culture and education policy, has its very important part in this professionalization, but also in the general process of supporting civil society, because those are donors who are very close to the civil society, who are even nearly part of civil society, who have much better and much more dense networks in society, and they are sort of pearl divers. So they are finding new trends, new issues, new activists in society. They have often a very unconventional style of supporting these activists. For example, they do not only give money. If they give money, these are smaller amounts, but they just open their offices for these activists. They are okay with, if you have to do any copies, you can use our copying machine. You can meet in our rooms, etc. So these are strategies of picking and finding those activists, bringing them together and supporting them on a very basic level. It might be, and I could show this in my research, that after 2 or 3 years being supported by a political foundation, for example, that these organizations now have a beautiful reference list and that they shift over to the larger budgets of the USAID, for example. But anyway, the culture institutes and all those supporting the culture activists, the niche issues, are those who are finding progressive and interesting new things that are going on in the society, and those activists who start new ideas and new discussions. So we could see this in Ukraine in particular when we're looking back on which organizations were founded in the cultural or in the culture and arts landscape in Ukraine, and which then became important in the politicization or the democratization process, in particular since the Euromaidan. And the interesting aspect is that most of those actors who were active in the Euromaidan and who enriched the Euromaidan, very short, had been founded in the years after the Orange Revolution, and in particular became more strong and more popular also in the authoritarian phase of the Yanukovych administration between 2010 and 2013. So here we see that in particular progressive arts, progressive culture, new ways of how to think about authoritarianization in a way that the authoritarian forces won't smash all your activities immediately, but staying beyond the radar, was in particular important for these organizations who later came up, supported the Euromaidan, and support the democratization process in Ukraine until today. So for example, there are these organizations like the Revolutionary Experimental Space, founded in 2004, the organization Kultura Medialna, founded in 2005 from Dnipro, the Visual Cultural Research Center, 2008. These are organizations that are extremely present still today in Ukraine, and these are culture activists. These are organizations that are not in the first point or in the first way political, but these are artists, communities, things like that, that have been supported by the Goethe Institute, for example, by the political foundations for a long time. And now, when it comes to those institutions or those actors and organizations who shape a new, more democratic, a more pluralistic Ukraine, we see a transfer of the knowledge, of the persons, of the people, and of the strategies from these small arts and cultural realms into the new institutions, as for example, these are some of the NGOs, in the institutions like the National Arts Gallery, the National Center of the Film Archive, etc. So these are national big institutions who are now run by those activists that started very, very, very small with the aid of some cultural support and with, for example, organizing some film festivals, etc. And this is the way, I would argue, how cultural support and cultural and education policy can strengthen democracy. It is not about strengthening the watchdogs, but it is about strengthening those who are rather working in society, with society, who are picking new and progressive issues, who start debates where there have never been debates before because the issues were not relevant or they were not on the surface of the society. This pearl diving and network approach of external cultural and education policy is worse for evaluating because you cannot have a checklist of, okay, this is a democratization or democratizing activity and that one as well, and I was successful here in fostering democracy. But in the long term, it's the more successful strategy than only supporting the watchdogs. Thank you so much also for a few minutes over time.